Sorry, I hadn't realised we'd started. Welcome to Lecture 6. Now, together with Lectures 4 and 5, Lecture 6 makes up a trilogy. Let me illustrate this geometrically by using a triangle with each side representing one of the major forces at play that we have been talking about in Lectures 4 and 5 and will talk about in this lecture. Now let's make it an equilateral triangle so there's no argument. The base of the triangle represents the Zulus. One side represents the Voortrekkers. The third side represents the British. Lecture 4 dealt with relationships between the Voortrekkers and the Zulus. Lecture 5 dealt with relationships between the British and the Zulus. Lecture 6 will deal with relations between the Voortrekkers and the British. British-Boer relations culminated in the Anglo-Boer Wars, Voortrekking had long come to an end, and in fact the Boer community was much wider than the Voortrekkers and their descendants. From the vantage of hindsight, it's easy to see that from the outset of British occupation of Cape Colony, there was a strategic objective, at least on the part of some key players on the British side, that could not and would not accept Boer sovereignty in any form. As early as 1795, when the Dutch first faltered under French influence and the British occupied Cape Colony for the first time, they were quick to quash Trek-Boer initiatives in setting up independent Boer states at Graaf Reinet and Swellendam. This was even before the Voortrekkers. The later Voortrekkers' ambitions to set up independent states across the Orange and Vaal rivers were at the very best tolerated by the British, and that was only until the stakes got too high. Gold and diamonds were key factors in changing the stakes and in fact in changing the whole political outlook. Skirmishes between the British and the Boers had taken place long before the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer Wars of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But it was the British annexation of the Boer Republic of Transvaal in 1879 and the Boer response a few years later in declaring its independence from Britain that lit the fuse that led to all-out war. Thus it was in 1880 that the First Anglo-Boer War commenced. Australian sources do not even allude to the fact that there was more than one Boer War, or more than one Anglo-Boer War, I should say. In fact, there were two recorded in most history sources. You could make a reasonable case for saying there were more if you add earlier battles, for example, the Battle of Congela in Natal. The First Boer War spanned 1880 to 1881, but in fact only lasted 3 months. Perhaps it was some early and surprising victories on the Boers' side that led the British to fairly quickly sign a peace treaty, under which the Boers would have self-rule in the Transvaal, but the British would maintain control over foreign relations, African affairs, and native districts. The Second Anglo-Boer War was of a completely different order. It was a full-scale war that descended into savage guerrilla warfare and was infamous for its inhumane treatment and killing of civilians. What changed the situation that led to the Second Anglo-Boer War, apart perhaps from the British feeling they were defeated in the First War, was the discovery of a monumental gold deposit at Witwatersrand on the outskirts of what would fast become the city of Johannesburg. The huge influx of wealth seekers soon meant that the non-Boer population of Transvaal had significantly increased. Within 10 years, the miners' camp would become the largest city in South Africa. The dynamics of Boer-British relations were fast changing. Transvaal was suddenly, potentially, the richest state in southern Africa, with all the political power that comes with that. It wasn't long before the large number of outsiders demanded a say in how the state was run and demanded a role in investment and in the management of gold ventures. And of course the British were right up there in all of this. Never far away, of course, was the ultimate British goal of a British-controlled federation. Negotiations on a range of these sorts of issues were not particularly productive, and the president of the Boer Republic of Transvaal, Paul Kruger, issued an ultimatum to the British in 1899 for them to withdraw all their troops from both the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Otherwise, he would declare war on Britain. Well, obviously, Britain wasn't going to bow down to that, and war was declared. And thus began the Second Anglo-Boer War. It went from 1899 to 1902. Historians divide the Second Anglo-Boer War into 3 phases. In the first phase, the Boers mounted several preemptive strikes in British territory in Cape Colony and Natal, and besieged garrisons there. The Boers also won a series of tactical victories against British in their failed attempts to relieve the sieges. In the second phase, after receiving reinforcements, the British launched a further offensive in a second attempt to relieve the sieges of the garrisons. By mid-1900, the British had taken over the Orange Free State, they had entered Johannesburg and had taken over Pretoria. The Transvaal was annexed later in 1900, and to many it seemed the war was over. The third phase, however, saw a resurgence of Boer activity, which dragged the war on for another 2 years. Names like Louis Botha and Jan Smuts took on the leadership of the Boers and entered into a protracted guerrilla warfare. The Boers raided targets such as British troop columns, telegraph lines, depots, and railways. In order to cut off supplies to the Boer raiders, the British, now under the command of Lord Kitchener, entered into a scorched earth policy. 30,000 Boer farms were burned. Blockhouses were set up, many Boer families were broken up and displaced. Concentration camps were set up where Boer civilians were housed in awful conditions. There are many pathetic stories about what went on in this third phase, but eventually the war did come to an end in 1902. That was followed eventually by the emergence of the Republic of South Africa. Let me just say a few words about Australia's involvement in the Anglo-Boer War. We were not involved in the first war, which is probably why Australian sources generally overlook it. But about 16,000 people volunteered to join British forces in the Second Anglo-Boer War, which we usually just refer to as the Boer War. It remains Australia's third worst war for casualties, far outstripping Vietnam. Over 600 Australians died in the 2 years in which they were fighting, which is more than the number that died in 10 years in Vietnam. Of course, when the war broke out in 1899, Australia wasn't Australia as such. It was still a series of 6 colonies, and the volunteers fought essentially as British forces. After Australian Federation in 1901, the Australian government then sent an additional 8 battalions. In addition to the troops that went from Australia, there were thousands of Australians working in the gold mines there who also signed up. Australians generally supported the war at the outset, but public enthusiasm began to wane soon after 1900. The Australian public became disenchanted with the way the Boers were being treated, particularly civilians in concentration camps. And then, of course, there was the court-martial of Lieutenant Breaker Morant and Lieutenant Hancock. These factors made the war a lot less palatable to the Australian public. On that note, let me bring an end to the lecture on relations between the British and the Boers. I'd just like to add that this is the first and possibly only time that I have worn a suit and tie since I retired. I hope you appreciate that.